Before the rain ever fell, Enoch was shown who and what would outlast the flood. And it wasn't the righteous alone. Scripture hints at something that survived that shouldn't have. What if Noah's ark wasn't the only thing that made it through? Genesis tells us that Noah built an ark, that the animals came 2 by 2, and that the waters covered the earth. Most of us have heard that story since childhood, told in soft tones meant for Sunday school walls. But there is another account, one that circulated among the earliest believers, one that Jude himself quoted in the New Testament, and it paints a very different picture of what actually survived those 40 days and nights. The Book of Enoch claims that centuries before the floodwaters rose, Enoch was taken up and shown the future, not in vague symbols, but in detail. He saw the corruption spreading across the earth, the watchers, angelic beings who Genesis 6 says saw that the daughters of man were attractive and took wives for themselves, producing offspring described as Nephilim, giants whose violence filled the land. Enoch 1:9 describes a Lord who will come with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all. This wasn't only a judgment on humanity, it was a judgment on something else entirely, something that had crossed a line no creature was meant to cross. Here's where it gets uncomfortable for a lot of churchgoers. The flood wasn't just cleansing sin in the abstract sense we're used to hearing about. According to Enoch, and echoed in Jubilees, the flood was a direct response to a biological corruption, a mixing of angelic and human bloodlines that produced beings so violent, so consuming, that Genesis 6:5 says, "Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." The Book of Jubilees goes further, stating that the giants devoured everything around them, turning on animals, then on each other, then on humanity itself. This is not the gentle Sunday school flood. This is a planet in crisis, and Noah's Ark becomes something far more specific than a boat for animals. It becomes the one vessel engineered to preserve an untainted bloodline. So when Enoch was given his vision, what exactly did he see surviving? Scripture and the extra-biblical record both agree on the obvious answer. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. 8 people. But here's the detail most teachings skip entirely. Genesis 6:9 tells us Noah was perfect in his generations, a strange phrasing if you sit with it, not simply righteous, not simply obedient. Perfect in his generations, meaning his lineage itself, his very genetic line, remained untouched by whatever had corrupted the rest of humanity. The ark wasn't only preserving righteousness, it was preserving purity of bloodline, at a moment when very few bloodlines on earth could make that claim. And this is where Enoch's vision becomes unsettling in a different way. Enoch 10:9 records God's instruction concerning the giants themselves, that they should be destroyed, and their spirits made restless. Language that implies the physical bodies could perish, while something of them lingered on in a form the text never fully explains. If the flood was meant to erase every trace of the Watcher's corruption, why does the Book of Numbers, written centuries after the flood, still mention giants in the land? Numbers 13:33 records the spies returning from Canaan, terrified, saying, "There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers." If the flood wiped out every trace of that bloodline, how were the Israelites still encountering their descendants generations later? Enoch's account, along with the Book of Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggests the answer lies in what or who else made it through. Some ancient Jewish traditions, including material preserved in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, hint that Noah's own household wasn't quite as sealed off as the traditional story implies. There are whispers, preserved outside of Genesis itself, of a 4th son, Ham's wife carrying something into the ark that shouldn't have survived the judgment at all. Whether that's literal or symbolic is something scholars still argue over today, but the pattern is consistent across multiple ancient sources. Something crossed over, something that wasn't supposed to. Josephus, writing centuries later in Antiquities of the Jews, adds another layer worth sitting with. He records that the descendants of those who survived the flood were still, in his words, of gigantic stature, and that their remains were spoken of long after Noah's line had spread across the earth. A Jewish historian, writing for a Roman audience, had no reason to invent such a detail. He was simply passing along what was already understood and accepted among his own people, that the flood, whatever else it accomplished, left a door open somewhere. This is the piece that Enoch's vision forces us to sit with. The flood wasn't a clean reset button. It was a judgment that, according to the very same texts describing it, didn't fully accomplish what it set out to do. Giants reappear, corrupted bloodlines resurface, and later Scripture, Deuteronomy 3:11, describes King Og of Bashan. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. His iron bed, measuring over 13 feet long, confirms that whatever survived the flood wasn't confined to Enoch's prophecy. It became history, recorded plainly, sitting right there in the text most of us read past without a second thought. If Enoch really was shown what would survive the flood, and if what survived wasn't only Noah's family, but something else entirely, then the story we were taught as children is missing its most important chapter. And that missing chapter is exactly what we're going to walk through together in this video. Before we go further, I want to point you towards something we've put together for exactly this kind of question. It's called the Forbidden Book of Enoch Guide, a fully illustrated companion that walks through Enoch's visions, the Watchers, the Giants, and the world before the flood in a way that connects every thread we're about to cover today. If you've ever wanted the full picture laid out in front of you, rather than pieced together video by video, the link is waiting in the pinned comment below this video. It's become one of the most requested resources we've ever put together, and once you go through it, this next part of the story is going to make a lot more sense. And if this kind of biblical mystery is the kind of thing that keeps you asking questions long after the video ends, take a second and subscribe to the channel. We go into these hidden corners of Scripture every single week, and you won't want to miss where this one is headed next. To understand what Enoch actually saw, we have to go back further than the flood itself, back to the moment the corruption began. Genesis 6:2 says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." 4 words most readers skim right past. Sons of God carry enormous weight in the ancient world. This phrase, Ben Elohim, in the original Hebrew, appears elsewhere in Scripture referring specifically to angelic beings, not human kings or judges, as some later interpretations tried to claim. Job 1.6 uses the exact same phrase to describe heavenly beings presenting themselves before the Lord. The earliest Jewish readers of Genesis understood this passage the way Enoch describes it in detail: angels, not men, crossing a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. Enoch names them. 200 watchers, led by a being called Semjaza, descended on Mount Hermon and bound themselves by oath to carry out their plan together. The mountain's name itself, according to Enoch, comes from that moment, because it was there that the watchers swore themselves to one another and cursed themselves if any of them backed out. This is important because it shows a level of premeditation that Genesis alone never spells out. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across different regions. This was an organized descent, a pact entered into with full awareness of the consequences. Enoch 6:6 records that they took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them. This wasn't seduction in any romantic sense we'd recognize. It was a calculated, collective decision by beings who understood exactly what they were doing and what it would produce. And what it produced were the Nephilim, described in Genesis 6:4 simply as the mighty men which were of old, men of renown, but described by Enoch in far more disturbing terms, and described again in the Book of Giants, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, as beings who dreamed troubling dreams of their own coming destruction, aware on some level that judgment was already approaching. According to Enoch 7:2, the offspring of these unions grew in accordance with their greatness, until they consumed everything humanity produced. When the harvest could no longer feed them, Enoch says, they turned on humanity itself, devouring flesh and drinking blood. This is not poetic exaggeration meant to frighten children. This is presented as historical memory, passed down through oral tradition long before it was ever written into the text we now call Enoch. And it explains something Genesis leaves oddly unexplained: why God's response to human wickedness in Genesis 6:5 is described in such total terms. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. A civilization terrorized by beings that were part angel, part human, consuming everything around them, would produce exactly that kind of despair. But the Watchers didn't stop at reproduction. Enoch 8 describes what came next, and this is the part most churches never touch. Azazel, one of the lead Watchers, taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, introducing warfare technology that had no precedent among early humanity. Other Watchers taught the cutting of roots and the knowledge of plants, astrology, the reading of stars and omens and cosmetics, the art of adorning the body in ways Enoch describes as leading humanity toward vanity, deception, and spiritual corruption. Knowledge itself became a weapon, handed down by beings who had no right to hand it down, and humanity was never the same. What makes this detail so striking is how it reframes the entire early history of civilization. We're taught to think of technological and cultural advancement as a slow, natural climb out of primitive beginnings. Enoch suggests something far stranger, that certain leaps forward, particularly in metallurgy and warfare, came from an outside source, granted before humanity was prepared to handle the consequences of that knowledge. This is why the flood cannot be understood as a simple morality tale about sin in general. It was a targeted response to a specific and unprecedented crisis, an angelic rebellion that had physically altered the human bloodline and technologically accelerated humanity's capacity for violence far beyond what it could safely handle. Enoch 9 describes the four archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, looking down at the earth and seeing much blood shed upon the earth and all lawlessness being wrought upon the earth. They bring this directly before God, pleading on behalf of a creation that had lost the ability to defend itself, and it's this appeal, according to Enoch, that sets the flood in motion. What's remarkable is how much of this framework survives, even in fragmented form within accepted scripture, despite centuries of that framework being pushed to the margins of mainstream teaching. Jude 1:6 references angels who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Jude isn't inventing this idea. He's referencing a tradition his readers would have immediately recognized, one detailed at length in the very Book of Enoch we're walking through now. 2 Peter 2:4 echoes the same idea, describing angels who sinned being cast down and delivered into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Two separate New Testament authors, writing to two different audiences decades apart, both assume their readers already understand this backstory well enough that neither of them feels the need to explain it in full. So when Enoch is shown the flood approaching, he isn't simply being shown rain and a boat. He's being shown the resolution to a conflict that began generations earlier, involving beings whose rebellion had already reshaped the physical and spiritual landscape of the entire earth. It's worth pausing here to consider how differently this reads compared to the version most of us grew up with. We were taught that God looked down, saw generic wickedness, and decided to start over. Enoch gives us something far more specific, a chain of cause and effect, beginning with a rebellion in the heavens, moving through a corruption of the human bloodline, and ending in a judgment that had to be total precisely because the threat itself had become uncontainable by any lesser measure. Understanding this is essential before we can understand what Enoch saw surviving, because survival, in this context, means something far more specific than we've been led to believe. It means the continuation, or the interruption, of bloodlines that were never supposed to exist in the first place. Enoch's actual vision of the flood itself is worth slowing down on, because the language he uses is far more specific than the brief account we find in Genesis, and the specificity itself is telling. Enoch 10:2 records God speaking directly to the archangel Uriel, instructing him to go to Noah and warn him. "Go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth." Notice the wording, hide thyself. Not simply prepare a boat, but hide, language suggesting Noah wasn't only escaping water, he was escaping something actively hunting or threatening him. Given everything we've already covered about the Watchers and their offspring, that word choice carries real weight. This detail matters because it reframes Noah's entire situation. He wasn't living peacefully among his neighbors, receiving a random warning from heaven and calmly beginning construction. According to this account, he was a marked man, one of the last carriers of an untainted bloodline in a world where that had become vanishingly rare, hunted less by armies than by the sheer weight of a corruption spreading faster than he could outrun it. Every day he spent building the ark, he was doing so under a kind of siege, surrounded by a population increasingly overtaken by corruption on every side, watching the world he had known his entire life slip further and further from anything recognizable. Consider what that would have actually looked like. A man, his sons beside him, cutting timber and sealing beams while neighbors mocked him, while giants roamed nearby, while the very fabric of the world he'd grown up in continued unraveling around him. Genesis 6:8 tells us simply that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, but Enoch's account gives us the desperate context behind why that grace was so urgently needed. The instruction to Uriel continues in Enoch 10:3, where God says, "And instruct him that he may escape, and his seed may be preserved for all the generations of the world." That phrase, "his seed may be preserved," is doing enormous work here. This isn't language about saving righteous individuals in a general sense. This is language about preserving a bloodline specifically, protecting genetic continuity at a moment in history when very few lines remained untouched by the Watcher's corruption. It's the kind of phrase that, once you notice it, changes how you read the rest of the flood narrative entirely. The ark, in this reading, functions less like a lifeboat and more like a genetic vault, carrying forward the one lineage still capable of representing what humanity was originally created to be, sealed off from a world that had drifted almost entirely beyond recognition. This is where Enoch becomes especially vivid. Enoch 10:15 describes the judgment against the fallen angels themselves. "Bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment." Their offspring, the giants who had terrorized humanity, are described separately with a fate that unfolds differently from their fathers. Enoch 10:9 instructs that they be destroyed through mutual slaughter. Send them one against another, that they may destroy each other in battle. A detail that suggests their end wasn't only the floodwaters themselves, but a chaotic self-destruction that preceded it, as the giants turned on one another in their final days, exactly as they had once turned on humanity when the harvest could no longer sustain their appetite. This raises an uncomfortable question that Enoch's account doesn't shy away from, one that forces us to reconsider what ending a threat like this could have actually meant. If the giants were destroyed through both mutual violence and the flood, what happened to whatever it was that made them what they were? Enoch 15:8 gives us the answer, and it's one of the strangest passages in the entire text. It describes the spirits of the giants as evil spirits that shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Their physical bodies perished in the judgment, but according to Enoch, something of them didn't simply vanish. Something remained, untethered from flesh, still present on the earth after the waters finally receded and the ground began to dry. This single detail reshapes how we understand the rest of Scripture's engagement with spiritual warfare. It's a detail Genesis never addresses directly, yet it would go a long way toward explaining why Scripture continues describing spiritual opposition and demonic activity long after the flood supposedly reset creation, and why the language used to describe these entities so often echoes back to this exact origin point. The Book of Jubilees adds another dimension to this picture, one that fills in gaps Genesis simply doesn't address. Jubilees 5:19 states plainly that God did not spare the giants, for they thought to do evil to each other and to commit fornication upon the earth. But Jubilees also records something Genesis leaves out entirely, a specific request from Noah himself after the flood, asking God to bind the remaining evil spirits so they could no longer harm his descendants. Jubilees 10:5 records Noah praying, "Let not the spirits of the dead have power over the spirits of the living." This single line tells us that even Noah, standing on solid ground after surviving the deluge, watching the waters finally recede after everything his family had endured, understood that the danger hadn't fully ended. Something had survived. Something still needed to be contained. And this is precisely the tension Enoch's vision forces us to confront. The flood accomplished what it needed to physically. It removed the giants from the earth. It purified Noah's bloodline enough to continue humanity's story. But spiritually, according to these texts, the corruption was never fully erased. It was contained, restrained, pushed back to a manageable threat rather than eliminated outright. And containment, as anyone familiar with Scripture's later chapters knows, has a way of eventually breaking down. The very fact that later books of the Bible continue wrestling with unclean spirits, with demonic oppression, with giants reappearing generations after the waters had long since receded, suggests that whatever Enoch saw in his vision wasn't the end of the story. It was only the first chapter of a much longer struggle, one that Scripture continues tracing all the way through to the ministry of Christ himself, who repeatedly confronted unclean spirits with an authority that suggests he understood exactly what they were and where they had come from. If something of the old corruption survived in spirit form, the next question becomes unavoidable. Did it also survive in flesh? This is where the story takes its strangest turn, and it centers on a single figure most people barely notice when they read Genesis, skimming past his name on the way to more familiar territory: Ham, Noah's own son. Genesis 9:22 describes an incident after the flood that has puzzled readers for centuries, one that feels strangely out of place against the backdrop of humanity finally starting over. Ham saw the nakedness of his father while Noah lay drunk in his tent, and rather than covering him respectfully as his brothers did, Ham went out and told them what he'd seen. Noah's response, once he wakes and realizes what happened, is shocking in its severity. Genesis 9:25 records him cursing not Ham directly, but Ham's son. "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." Think about that for a moment and let it sit uncomfortably the way it should. An adult son commits an offense, and the curse falls not on him but on his child, already born, already present in the world. Why would a curse of that magnitude land on someone who wasn't even the one who acted? Ancient Jewish commentary, preserved in sources like the Babylonian Talmud and later Midrash, wrestled with this same question for generations, and their answers go far beyond simple embarrassment at seeing a parent unclothed. Some rabbinic traditions suggest that what happened in that tent involved something far more serious than voyeurism, hinting at an act of profound violation that Genesis describes only in the most restrained possible language, exactly the kind of restraint ancient texts often use when recording something too disturbing to state outright. It's worth noting that this pattern of restraint isn't unique to this passage. Ancient Hebrew narrative frequently compresses its most horrifying moments into a handful of words, trusting its original audience to understand implications a modern reader might miss entirely on a casual read-through. Whatever occurred, the severity of Noah's curse tells us plainly that the offense wasn't minor, and the fact that the curse specifically targets Canaan, a child already conceived by the time the flood ended, raises the very question we've been building toward. What if Canaan's line carried something forward that the flood was supposed to have ended? Numbers 13:22 tells us plainly where the descendants of Canaan settled, the very land later given to Israel, a region whose original inhabitants included the Anakim, described repeatedly and unmistakably as giants. Deuteronomy 2:10 records that the Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims. Deuteronomy 2:11 goes further, stating outright, "which also were accounted giants as the Anakims, but the Moabites call them Emims." Different names, different regions, but the same unmistakable description recurring throughout the record. These aren't isolated references buried in obscure genealogies. They appear again and again throughout the historical books, describing an entire population of unusually large, unusually violent peoples occupying Canaan by the time Israel arrived generations after the flood, so consistently documented across multiple books of Scripture, that dismissing them as legend requires ignoring the plain text itself. If the flood was meant to remove every trace of the pre-flood corruption, how do we account for an entire region populated by giants, directly descended from the very son Noah cursed, appearing again and again throughout Israel's later history as a persistent, unavoidable enemy. Enoch's own account gives us a partial answer, one that connects directly back to what we covered regarding the surviving spirits of the giants. If disembodied spirits from before the flood remained active on the earth, Spirits Jubilees describes Noah specifically praying to have contained, then a second corruption of human bloodlines after the flood becomes entirely plausible within this framework. The same pattern that occurred before, spiritual beings crossing a boundary they weren't meant to cross, appears to have happened again, and this time using the surviving remnant of the pre-flood corruption rather than angels descending fresh from heaven, a subtler repetition of the original crime rather than a bold new rebellion. This reframes Canaan's curse entirely. It's no longer simply a punishment for a single act of disrespect toward his father. It becomes a prophetic acknowledgement of what that bloodline would carry forward and produce for centuries afterward. The very giants Israel would later encounter, the very people God would specifically instruct Israel to drive out of the land entirely, generation after generation, as though the war against this bloodline could never truly be considered finished. Deuteronomy 20:17 commands total destruction of these Canaanite peoples, language that feels excessive by any ordinary standard of ancient warfare, until you consider it through the lens Enoch provides and remember exactly what these peoples were believed to descend from. This wasn't conquest for territory alone. It was, according to this reading, a continuation of the same judgment that began with the flood itself, aimed at a bloodline still carrying the corruption Noah's family was originally set apart to escape. Genesis Apocryphon, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, adds a fascinating layer to this picture that most readers have never encountered. It records Noah's own wife, Barthenosh, swearing an oath regarding the legitimacy of her son Shem's lineage, addressing directly the fear that something other than Noah's seed had entered the family line, a fear serious enough that it needed to be sworn away formally rather than simply assumed. Whether this reflects genuine ancient tradition or later theological anxiety, its very existence tells us something important. The question of bloodline purity after the flood wasn't invented by modern researchers looking for hidden meaning. It was a live concern among ancient Jewish communities themselves, preserved in their own extra-biblical writings, wrestled with by rabbis centuries before anyone alive today ever opened a Bible. What Enoch saw then wasn't a single moment of judgment that permanently resolved the crisis he'd been shown. It was the beginning of a much longer struggle, one that would replay itself across generations, through Canaan, through the giants of the Promised Land, through battles Israel would fight centuries later, against enemies whose origins traced directly back to the very corruption the flood was meant to end. And once you start reading Israel's later military campaigns through this lens, entire chapters of the historical books begin to read differently, less as ordinary territorial conquest, and more as the continuation of a war that began long before Joshua ever crossed the Jordan. There's a reason this story keeps circling back to the same physical locations, and it's worth pausing here to look at what's actually still sitting on the ground in those regions today, long after the texts describing them were first written down. If Enoch's vision and the surrounding ancient texts describe a pre-flood world advanced enough to produce beings capable of teaching metallurgy, warfare, and astrology, we'd expect to find traces of that advancement somewhere, assuming any of it survived the flood at all. And in a handful of locations around the world, archaeologists have found exactly the kind of anomaly that raises more questions than it answers. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey is the clearest example. Dated to roughly 9600 BC, it predates Stonehenge by around 6,000 years and predates the invention of agriculture and pottery as we understand their timeline. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, are carved with intricate depictions of animals and abstract symbols, arranged in precise circular formations by a civilization that, according to conventional history, shouldn't have possessed the social organization or tool technology to accomplish something of this scale. Researchers who first uncovered the site openly admitted it upended their assumptions about how early human society developed, since everything we thought we understood about the order of agriculture, settlement, and monumental construction seemed to be turned entirely on its head by what the excavation revealed. And yet there it stands, deliberately buried under tons of earth at some point in antiquity, as though someone wanted it hidden rather than destroyed. Why bury a temple instead of simply abandoning it to decay naturally? Baalbek in Lebanon presents a similar puzzle. The site contains a foundation platform built from stones so massive that modern engineering would struggle to move them without specialized machinery. The largest, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs an estimated 1,000 tons, larger than any single stone ever moved by any confirmed ancient construction project anywhere else on Earth. No definitive explanation exists for how ancient builders quarried, transported, and positioned stones of that scale, using only the tools we assume were available to them at the time. Local legend, predating any Roman construction later built on top of the site, describes the platform as the work of giants, a detail that lines up unnervingly well with everything Enoch and Genesis describe about the pre-flood and immediately post-flood world. Then there's Pumapunku in modern-day Bolivia, where precisely cut andesite blocks display interlocking geometric patterns so exact that some researchers have argued they resemble machine-tooled work rather than hand-carving, a level of standardization that seems out of place among the surrounding ruins from the same broader region. Sacsayhuamán in Peru shows the same pattern, massive stones fitted together with such precision that not even a blade of grass can slip between the joints, despite each stone being irregularly shaped rather than uniform, cut on multiple angles that somehow interlock perfectly with their neighbors on every side. A technique modern stonemasons still find difficult to replicate even with power tools. And Yonaguni, submerged off the coast of Japan, presents underwater formations that some researchers argue show clear signs of deliberate shaping rather than natural erosion, raising uncomfortable questions about what the coastline looked like before sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Precisely the kind of global environmental shift a flood of biblical proportions would have caused. None of this proves Enoch's account outright, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. Mainstream archaeology offers its own explanations for each of these sites, and reasonable people can disagree about how much weight to place on their anomalies. But taken together, they paint a picture worth sitting with, one that grows harder to dismiss the more of these sites you place side by side. Across multiple continents, in locations with no direct contact with one another in the ancient world, we find monumental architecture that predates or defies our expected timeline for human technological development, built with a level of precision that still challenges modern engineers to explain even with the benefit of cranes, lasers, and computer modeling. If a pre-flood civilization existed with knowledge passed down by beings like the Watchers, exactly the kind of knowledge Enoch describes Azazel and his companions introducing, these sites are precisely the kind of fingerprint we might expect that civilization to leave behind before catastrophe erased almost everything else. This is where the story Enoch was shown stops being a purely spiritual account and starts intersecting with something we can, at least partially, still walk around and touch today. Something that turns an ancient prophecy into a physical trail we can follow across the modern map. The Book of Enoch tells us that the knowledge given by the Watchers wasn't only about warfare and cosmetics. Enoch 8:3 lists additional teachings: the cutting of roots, the observation of stars, the knowledge of the clouds, and what Enoch calls the signs of the earth. This is knowledge that in a pre-industrial world would have looked indistinguishable from what we might now call advanced engineering or astronomical calculation, precisely the kind of expertise required to align massive stone structures with celestial events with a level of accuracy that has surprised even skeptical researchers, something documented at multiple ancient sites, including Göbekli Tepe itself. What makes this connection especially compelling is the geography. Mount Hermon, where Enoch says the Watchers descended and bound themselves by oath, sits in the same broader region as many of these anomalous sites, within a few hundred miles of locations described throughout the ancient Near East as places of unusual power and forbidden knowledge. Whether that's coincidence or something more deliberate is a question we may never definitively answer. But for a viewer sitting with all of this together, the flood story stops feeling like an isolated fable from a distant, disconnected past. It starts feeling like the explanation for why our world looks the way it does, why certain places on Earth carry a weight and a mystery that resists easy explanation, and why Scripture itself keeps circling back to giants, to forbidden knowledge, and to bloodlines that were never quite as clean as the story we were told as children. And once that connection settles in, it becomes very difficult to look at any of these sites the same way again, whether you're standing in front of them in person, watching a documentary about them, or simply looking at photographs from your own living room, because the pattern once seen is hard to unsee. What Enoch saw wasn't a clean ending. It was a warning that the struggle would continue long after the waters receded, carried forward in bloodlines, in buried stones, in a battle Scripture never actually declares finished. Genesis 3:15 spoke of enmity between two seeds long before the flood ever came, and everything we've walked through today suggests that enmity outlasted the flood too, reaching all the way into the promised land and beyond. If this opened your eyes to something Sunday school never covered, the Forbidden Book of Enoch guide waits for you in the pinned comment, walking through every thread we touched on today in far greater depth. Thank you for spending this time with us. Subscribe, like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and stay for what's coming next on the screen.